David Carter had just left the convention center in San Diego, where he had delivered a powerful presentation on criminal justice reform. It was nearly 10:30 p.m., and the I-5 freeway was quiet, with only the glow of streetlights passing over his Tesla Model S. He turned up the heat slightly to push back the chill of the ocean breeze. He wasn't in a hurry. His speed stayed at 35 miles per hour, well within the legal limit. Suddenly, flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. A Ford Explorer police SUV pulled up behind him, sirens blaring, signaling him to pull over. David frowned but remained calm, easing his car onto the shoulder. He glanced in the mirror. A tall, broad-shouldered white officer was approaching, his stride slow but commanding. David rolled down his window as the officer stopped beside his car. "License and registration," the officer said curtly, his sharp gaze scanning the sleek interior of the Tesla. David handed over his documents without hesitation, but he immediately noticed the suspicion in the officer's eyes. Then came the question, one loaded with meaning. "Is this your car?" His heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of the familiar rising fury, one he knew all too well. David took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He had been in situations like this before, too many times. His grip tightened on the steering wheel for a split second before he exhaled and looked up at the officer. "Yes," he said evenly. "It's my car. Is there a problem, officer?" The cop's eyes flickered with something, doubt, maybe suspicion. He studied David for a moment before glancing at the registration, then back at him. "Step out of the vehicle." David felt his pulse spike. He knew his rights. He had done nothing wrong, but he also knew how this could go if he refused. Swallowing his frustration, he pushed the door open and stepped out, his hands visible, movements slow and deliberate. The night air was cold against his skin. The officer circled him like a predator, sizing up its prey. "Where are you coming from?" "San Diego Convention Center," David replied. "I just gave a speech on criminal justice reform." He kept his voice measured, but inside, anger simmered beneath the surface. The cop let out a short, humorless chuckle. "That's so." He took a step closer, his hand resting near his holster. "Mind if I search your vehicle?" David's jaw clenched. "Actually, yes, I do mind. I haven't done anything illegal, and I'd like to know why I was pulled over in the first place." That was the moment everything shifted. The officer's demeanor hardened. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Step back," he ordered. Then before David could react, the officer grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back. Pain shot through David's shoulder as he stumbled forward. "What the hell?" His voice rose, but the officer was already pressing him against the hood of the Tesla, cold metal biting into his cheek. "You're resisting," the cop muttered, yanking his other arm back. "I'm not resisting," David snapped, fury surging through him. His heart pounded against his ribs as the realization sank in. This wasn't about a traffic violation. It never was. As he struggled to keep his breathing steady, another police SUV pulled up. Two more officers stepped out, watching with unreadable expressions. No one intervened. A passing car slowed down. A woman in the driver's seat pulled out her phone, recording. David locked eyes with her for a split second before the officer's voice cut through the air. "Turn that off." The woman didn't move. David could hear his own pulse in his ears. The cop's grip tightened. And just like that, David knew. This wasn't about the law. It was about power. And the worst part? He had seen this story play out before. David sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his wrists still sore from the tight handcuffs. His heart pounded with frustration, a slow-burning fire that refused to die down. He had been here before, not in this exact room, but in situations like this, where justice felt like an illusion and the law seemed to work against people like him. Across the table, Officer Carter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug expression plastered on his face. "So, David Wright," he drawled, as if savoring the moment, "mind telling me why you were acting so suspicious tonight?" David exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the metal table. "Suspicious?" His voice was steady, but rage simmered beneath the surface. "I was driving home. That's not a crime." Carter smirked. "Depends on who's behind the wheel." The words hung in the air like a threat. David's fingers curled into a fist under the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. Reacting emotionally would only feed into their game. He had seen it too many times. Innocent men goaded into anger, only to have their frustration used as evidence against them. Another officer, a younger one, shifted uncomfortably in the corner. He hadn't spoken since David was brought in, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was hesitation there, maybe even doubt, but the power dynamic in the room was clear, and the younger cop said nothing. David leaned forward. "Let's cut to the chase. You had no reason to pull me over. No broken taillight, no expired plates. Just me, in my own car, in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. So why am I here?" Carter chuckled, tapping his fingers against the table. "You lawyers always think you're smarter than everyone else." David stared at him, unblinking. He had spent years in courtrooms, defending people railroaded by a system designed to break them. But now, sitting in this cold room, he wasn't just an attorney. He was the accused. The door suddenly creaked open, and a third officer walked in, holding a phone. His face was tense. "Sir, we have a problem," he muttered to Carter. Carter frowned. "What?" The officer hesitated, then turned the screen toward him. David couldn't see it, but he knew exactly what it was. The video. The woman who had filmed the arrest must have posted it, and it was spreading. Carter's jaw tightened. "Son of a—" He stopped himself, rubbing his temple. David let out a slow breath. The shift in energy was palpable. The walls that once seemed impenetrable were cracking. Moments later, the station phone rang. One of the higher-ups must have seen the footage. Orders were coming down. Carter turned back to David, his expression no longer smug. "You're free to go." David stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. He met Carter's glare with unwavering eyes. "You should be careful," he said, his voice low but firm. "The world is watching now." And with that, he walked out, determined to make sure this story didn't end with him. David stepped out of the station into the crisp night air, his hands still trembling with frustration. The city lights flickered in the distance, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. He had won this round. The viral video had forced their hand. But was it really a victory? He was free, yet the officers who had humiliated and detained him without cause would still go back to their jobs the next day, unscathed and unapologetic. As he walked toward his car, a familiar voice called his name. Turning, he saw Lisa, the woman who had filmed the arrest, standing by the curb, phone in hand. Her face was a mix of concern and determination. "You okay?" she asked. David let out a bitter chuckle. "They let me go. That's something, right?" Lisa shook her head. "That's not enough." She handed him her phone, and he saw the video had already amassed hundreds of thousands of views. The comments were filled with outrage, demands for justice, and calls for accountability. People were angry, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been in his position. "David," Lisa said, voice firm, "we can't let this slide. If we don't push back, they'll keep doing this." David sighed, rubbing his temples. He had spent his career fighting cases like this, but this time it was personal. He wasn't just a lawyer defending someone else. He was the victim. He thought about the younger officer in the room, the one who had looked uneasy. Maybe there were cracks in the system. Maybe change was possible, but only if people like him fought for it. The next morning, David sat in front of a camera, staring into the lens. His social media accounts had already been flooded with messages of support. He had debated whether to stay silent, to move on, but deep down, he knew silence was complicity. Taking a deep breath, he hit record. "My name is David Wright. I am a lawyer, a citizen, and last night I was unlawfully detained by officers who saw me as a threat. Not because of anything I did, but because of who I am." He recounted everything: the unjustified stop, the condescending words, the humiliation of sitting in that interrogation room. He spoke not just for himself, but for everyone who had been through the same thing and never had a camera to prove their innocence. When he finished, he posted the video. Within minutes, the notifications exploded. Calls from news outlets flooded his inbox. The public wanted answers, and for once, the department couldn't ignore it. That evening, the police chief released a statement. "The department is conducting an internal investigation. We take these allegations seriously." A hollow response. A meaningless PR move. David clenched his fists. An internal investigation wouldn't bring justice. He wanted real change. The next morning, he filed a lawsuit against the city, not just for himself, but for every voice that had been silenced before him. David sat in his office, staring at the pile of legal documents in front of him. His lawsuit against the city had sent shockwaves through the system. News stations had picked up the story, civil rights groups had reached out, and public pressure was mounting. Yet deep down, he knew the battle had just begun. Justice wasn't won overnight, especially not against a system designed to protect itself. A sharp knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lisa stepped in, holding up her phone. "They finally responded," she said, pressing play on the video. The police chief appeared on the screen, his voice measured, rehearsed. "We acknowledge the concerns raised by Mr. Wright and the community. We are committed to transparency and reform." David exhaled sharply. "Transparency and reform," he muttered. "They always say that, but what does it actually mean?" Lisa gave him a determined look. "It means they're scared, and that's a start." The lawsuit was bigger than just his case now. It was about the system, about making sure no one else had to go through what he did. Protests erupted across the city, demanding accountability. Every time David stepped outside, strangers stopped him to say, "We're with you." For the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope. Change was possible, but only if they kept pushing. The story highlights the importance of confronting injustice and always standing up to defend what is right. One key lesson is not to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing, no matter where it occurs or who is involved. When faced with discrimination or unfairness, instead of ignoring it, stand up and demand justice. Silence only reinforces injustice, while our voices can bring about change. Additionally, perseverance and calmness are essential in any struggle. The composure and confidence shown by David not only help maintain mental strength, but also make the other party rethink their actions. In today's world, sometimes a small action can make a big difference. Remember, every step taken for justice, no matter how small, contributes to building a fairer community.